All right, now the video is working. Okay, so our topic for today, and we've got about 30 minutes, is Events in the Vietnam War Part 2, right? In your lecture outline, it just has the start of a bullet point list, so, you know, they don't all need to be under one bullet point. You know, when you hit a new piece of information, just hit enter, and it'll move to another bullet point. But in our notes and in our readings, we pretty much brought ourselves up to about 1968. So we're going to pick up there and talk about from 1968 through the end of the Vietnam War and wrap up by discussing some of the lessons that I think we can learn, or maybe not even lessons to learn, but questions that are raised by our experiences in Vietnam. So we're going to start off with President Johnson, because he is the one who in 1965 Americanized the war, right? We talked about that in the last set of notes. He made that decision to increase troop involvement. But today we're going to start with the Tet Offensive, because the Tet Offensive in many ways was the turning point of the Vietnam War. From 1965 to 1968, President Johnson had been continually increasing the number of bombing raids and the troop levels in Vietnam. And as the war dragged on, more and more people started questioning what we were doing there. But it really wasn't until the Tet Offensive that there was really a clear, sharp turning point in the war. So what happened? Well, during the holiday of Tet, which is basically a Vietnamese national holiday, both sides were used to there being a ceasefire. Right? Both sides would kind of take a break from the fighting, celebrate this holiday, and then afterwards fighting would resume. But in 1968, January of 1968, the Viet Cong launched surprise attacks against the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and on other U.S. strongholds in the South. I'll say that again. The Tet Offensive, January 1968, is when Viet Cong forces launched a surprise attack, coordinated surprise attack against the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and against U.S. strongholds across the South. Something like, 30-some different locations. Coordinated surprise attack. Really caught the U.S. off guard. Ultimately, the Viet Cong were forced back. They were beaten back by the U.S. And in fact, they took heavy losses. But despite the fact that this was really a military victory for the United States, it was a public opinion disaster. I'll say that again. Despite the fact that the U.S. military actually beat back the Viet Cong and could claim a military victory, the Tet Offensive was a public opinion and public relations disaster. So I'm going to show you guys a little short video clip here that has some footage, and it has a historian talking about the Tet Offensive to give you a little bit of perspective. Hopefully the sound will come through okay.
Is it possible to win a battle and lose the war? I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is the Tet Offensive, which began in late January 1968 and changed the direction of the Vietnam War. U.S. and South Vietnamese troops are hoping for a break from the fighting during that final week of January 1968. It was Tet, the beginning of the Lunar New Year, time of great celebrations in Vietnam. In previous years, both sides had observed a ceasefire to allow the country to celebrate its national holiday. But unbeknownst to the Americans and the South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the communist guerrillas operating in South Vietnam, had infiltrated towns and cities across the country. As the festivities for Tet began, they struck with ferocity, hitting targets like the Saigon International Airport, the Presidential Palace, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. After the initial surprise wore off, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces responded with devastating effectiveness, repulsing the attackers and inflicting huge losses. The Viet Cong were broken as a military force for the remainder of the war. But while the United States military scored a victory on the battlefield at Tet, the effect at home was quite different. The fighting at Tet helped turn American public opinion against the war and persuaded Lyndon Johnson not to run for re-election. The discrepancy between what happened in Vietnam and what happened at home has generated a slew of books and articles arguing that the news media's coverage of the Tet Offensive turned the American public against the Vietnam War. To be sure, journalists got a lot of the facts wrong early on in the Tet Offensive. Most famously, journalists reported that the Viet Cong had invaded the U.S. Embassy, when in fact they had only managed to get onto the embassy's grounds. Many Americans were horrified to see a photo of a South Vietnamese army general summarily executing a Viet Cong prisoner on the streets of Saigon. But the talk of how journalists covered the Tet Offensive misses the broader point. Context matters. Even before Tet, the American public had begun to sour on the Vietnam War. Polls done in the middle of summer of 1967 showed that a majority of Americans had concluded that the decision to become involved in Vietnam had been a mistake. The Johnson administration responded to these poll numbers by launching a public relations campaign to build support for the war. That included bringing home the commanding U.S. general from Vietnam, who told the American public that an important point had been reached where the end begins to come into view.
I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing.
Tet shattered the claim that the United States was making progress in South Vietnam. Americans began talking about a credibility gap because the Johnson administration had violated a cardinal rule of American politics: never overpromise and underdeliver. Preparing the public for setbacks and reversals is critical to succeeding with any foreign policy that requires a sustained political commitment. That lesson is worth keeping in mind if you talk about a potential military strike against Iran or intervening militarily in Syria.
Let's move on from there. So he mentions in this little clip here that in the United States, the impact that the Tet Offensive had on public opinion was significant. Okay, here's a chart from our textbook that shows you just how much so. Okay? If you look at President Johnson's approval ratings, here's before in the light blue, his handling of the presidency and his handling of the war, and afterwards you notice a significant drop. Okay? So, yes, there was a big hit on public opinion, right? More and more people started turning against the war after the Tet Offensive. But why does that matter, right? Why does public opinion matter so much? Well, it's important for us to understand that public opinion has an impact on elections, right? Democrats were being tied to Johnson in his handling of the war, so public opinion can have an impact on elections. And it also has an impact on how willing the American public is to continue to support a war. Public opinion can have an impact on elections, but it also has an impact on how willing the public is to continue to support a war. Right? The public is being asked to make personal sacrifices, financial sacrifices, right? People are being drafted. And as public opinion starts to go down, people are not willing to continue to make those sacrifices. So, as we know from the movie we watched, facing this huge drop in public opinion, President Johnson announced in 1968 that he would not seek re-election. And there's a clip right here that actually shows, that's actually Johnson. I'm not going to show the clip because we just actually saw it in the movie we finished. But that's the actual primary source. What happened there? That's the actual primary source clip. My order got all messed up here. Let me get back to, here we go. So Johnson announces he is not going to run in 1968. And that brings us to President Nixon. Okay. Richard Nixon was a Republican who ran for election in 1968. And he ran on a campaign of bringing the war to an end. In fact, I'm going to show you guys a campaign ad that he ran.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
This time, vote like your whole world depended on it.
Some good glittering generalities in that one. But that's the type of platform he's running on. That's the type of campaign he's running on, trying to change the course of the war and end it. So he is elected in 1968, and Johnson begins implementing a policy called Vietnamization. Important term. It's in our key vocabs. We need to know this term. And it's effectively the opposite of what Johnson did, right? Johnson Americanized the war. Nixon is going to Vietnamize it. So he begins to withdraw U.S. forces and hand the responsibility of fighting the war back to South Vietnam. Vietnamization, the process of basically giving the war back to South Vietnam. Nixon withdraws U.S. forces, puts more responsibility on South Vietnam to fight the war. While he did withdraw U.S. forces, so in our chart, which we'll finish, probably tomorrow, we see those numbers go up. They start to go back down under Nixon. But Nixon does, we're not ready for that one yet, Nixon does continue the war. Okay, the war does continue under him for several years. The U.S. tried several times during this period to come to a peace agreement with the North. But those talks continued to fail. And what do you think they kept failing to agree on?
With the communist or the
Bingo, right? The main issue that they could not agree on was whether they would remain two countries or one, right? Whether they would split up and share power. Meanwhile, as these peace talks keep breaking down, the war is dragging on. And public opinion continues to grow against the war. There are a couple important events that take place during Nixon's time in office that really stood out, right, in terms of big events that shaped public opinion. These are down in your terms box at the bottom there, but the first one is the My Lai massacre. It looks like My Lai, M-Y space L-A-I. The My Lai massacre, where it was reported, right, news got out, that U.S. troops had actually basically executed an entire village of Vietnamese. They were looking for, they went to the village looking for Viet Cong, didn't find them, ended up basically executing almost an entire village. And when news of that got out, it really shocked the American public. Again, turned even more public opinion against the war. That was the My Lai massacre. Again, this is a televised, photographed war. So it's not just words, right? Images are getting sent around the country, into people's living rooms, in their newspapers, so really shocked Americans. Second big event happened in 1970, the Kent State shootings. A lot of protests were happening on college campuses. And at one of those, a place called Kent State, National Guard troops actually opened fire on protesters, killing several. Under Nixon, the United States did pull ground troops out, but also kept the war going and actually increased the number of bombing raids that we were doing. And even approved sending troops in bombing inside of Cambodia. That's down in your terms as well, so you can spell it. Right? Cambodia was next door to Vietnam, is next door to Vietnam. And so yes, under Nixon, we're starting to pull back in terms of troops, but the war's continuing. Right? We're actually upping the bombing, and we actually ended up going into Cambodia. By 1973, we had finally made enough progress in our peace talks to come to an agreement with the North. And we signed what was called the Paris Peace Accords. (1973) Paris Peace Accords. And there were three main parts to the agreement that I want you to know about. The first was that there would be a ceasefire, right? The two sides would stop fighting. The second was that the U.S. would begin withdrawing our combat troops. And the third was that the North would release U.S. POWs, prisoners of war. Again, the three parts: a ceasefire, the U.S. would withdraw its combat troops, and the North would release U.S. prisoners of war, POWs. I do have a little video clip of Nixon's press conference where he announces this, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip past that for the time being, and we'll jump to President Ford. So once the U.S. pulls out of Vietnam, it's not long before fighting starts up again between the North and the South. Just this time, it's without the U.S. there, right? So there's kind of there's a ceasefire, the U.S. gets its troops out of there, and then it's not long before the North and the South go at it again. All right, but this time the U.S. is not involved. So the war, the Vietnam War actually really comes to a close, not under Nixon, because he ends up resigning, but his successor, President Gerald Ford. And in April of 1975, North Vietnam had taken over most of the South and was attacking the South's capital of Saigon. Unable to defend the capital, South Vietnam gave up, and the Vietnam War was over. So we're going to finish up by talking about sort of the legacy of the war. And for many, this picture here, it's a famous photo, really symbolizes, kind of what it came down to. This is actually people evacuating the U.S. Embassy in Saigon as the North was basically kicking down the gates to the city, right? That after all of these years and all of these lives lost, at the end of the day, the North defeated the South, and we were forced to flee from Saigon, right? So a lot of people were asking questions, right, and trying to figure out what were the lessons we can learn. So this is the last topic we'll talk about today, and I'm not going to be able to answer this question. Instead, what I'm going to give you are some questions that have come up that are important things to think about. Right? Because they apply today as we talk about things like what's happening in the Middle East, right? And in Syria and Russia and Ukraine, right? And these conflicts around the world, these are lessons that we need to think about today, right? So one question that we need to think about in terms of what we can learn from Vietnam is how informed should the public be about what's happening in a war situation, right? Put another way, how much of a right to know does the public have? Right? How much should the public be informed? Certainly some things are classified and need to be kept secret, but if you keep too much secret, it creates that issue of a credibility gap. Where do you draw the line? Again, like I said, I'm not giving you an answer here. There's no clear answer. These are just questions we have to think about. So that's one of them. How informed should the public be about what's happening in a war situation? A second important question, should there be restrictions on the media during wartime? Should there be restrictions on the media during wartime? Kind of related to the first one. Should the media be able to go in and basically kind of tag along with the Army and report on everything that they're seeing? Or should there perhaps be some restrictions there? A third question, how much influence should our military leaders have on policy decisions? I'll say that again. How much influence should our military leaders have on policy decisions? If you think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and certainly from what we've learned about Vietnam, right? The military had a big say in what we decided to do as a country, right? How much of a say should they have? That was kind of weird.
That was funny.
All right, we're almost done. One more question that I want you guys to get down to kind of think about, and this is a very broad one. To what extent should the United States involve itself in the affairs of other countries? Right? To what extent should the United States involve itself? This question's not going to get down by itself. You have to actually type. To what extent should the United States involve itself in the affairs of other countries? We're asking those same questions today, guys. Right? Talking about topics like ISIS and Syria and what happened in Ukraine. Right? Other areas of conflict in the world. These lessons from Vietnam certainly matter and don't really have easy answers. But they're important questions we have to think about. Okay? I will post this video so that if you need to go back and add a little bit more, you certainly can.